Welcome to Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. I'm your host, Liddell Hastings, and technical support is provided by Abel Amba. Today we are joined by Deanne Leblanc to discuss the topic of decolonization and the colonial denizen. Her article, The Role of Settler Canadians Within Decolonization, Reevaluating Invitation, Belonging and Rights, was an award winner within the CJPS journal. Insights by CJPS can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. To keep up to date with the CJPS monthly releases, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP. We hope you enjoy the listen. Welcome to the CJPS podcast with Deanne here. We're going to start you off with just a broad question about introducing yourself as both an academic and as a person, as much as you feel is relevant, and give a brief summarization of your article to lead us off into this discussion.
Great. Thank you, Liddell, and thank you for having me on the podcast. So my name is Deanne Leblanc. I am a non-Indigenous Canadian who grew up in Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, which include the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Chippewa. I defended my PhD dissertation, from which this article is based, in early 2020, and have been working with an Indigenous nonprofit organization since. So my article looks to provide non-Indigenous Canadians who are interested in contributing to decolonization with a thought experiment as proffered through the theory of the colonial denizen. I encourage non-Indigenous people to question their identity as Canadian citizens and the perceived innocence and neutrality that accompanies the concept of citizenship. By arguing that we should today and within our past think of ourselves as foreigners to Indigenous lands, who would and do still require invitation onto those lands, in order to legitimately be here. And that with this invitation, which is not guaranteed, we wouldn't magically become citizens but denizens, those who have access to the right to be on land only because they fulfill and continue to fulfill certain responsibilities and obligations.
And what lessons have you learned as a non-Indigenous academic within Indigenous studies? What lessons have you learned in terms of how you operate in the field, or what advice could you give to maybe future non-Indigenous scholars within the Indigenous field of I guess the ways in which you've had to operate different than, let's say, an Indigenous person within the field, and what kind of things have you had to be cognizant of when doing your research?
Yeah, it's ironic because within this article, I'm so focused on non-Indigenous people, but I would argue to decenter yourself from the discussion, which is where I'm trying to get to through this article. But there is necessary work that any non-Indigenous person, I think, needs to do that's very self or non-Indigenous sort of community, society focused in order to get there. But that would be my number one takeaway, is to identify yourself as a supporting actor in a discussion and in a movement that is, at the end of the day, not about you. It's about Indigenous resurgence.
And what brought you to theory in general within political science, and then more specifically Indigenous theory, opposed to the other fields within?
For sure. So I actually started by focusing on policy in my undergrad, specifically during my senior thesis, looking at educational public policy within Ontario. As in my third year, I had learned that students who attend school on reserve in Ontario are funded less than half per capita of what a student attending school off reserve is funded. And that was and remains an injustice that spurred an interest and a fire with me. It was only after I had done that work and graduated that I came across the book Strange Multiplicity by James Tully and began to realize the power behind modern political theory to really expand our thinking and offer us more out-of-the-box solutions or potential solutions to our problems. And so it was really that book that sent me along to the University of Victoria and ultimately UBC, where I dug deeper into theory from both non-Indigenous and Indigenous theorists and writers like Heidi Stark, John Burroughs, Glenn Coulthard, Barbara Arneal, just to name a few.
And you answered a large part of this question, but like, what are some major theories of work that you drew inspiration from in your research? And would you prescribe to maybe any people in Indigenous theory or theory more generally right now in their undergrad as seminal pieces to kind of to move forward from?
Oh gosh, there are so many. I unfortunately don't have like a list in front of me, and I've been out of the academy for about 3 years, and so haven't really been steeping myself in the same sort of way that I had been before. But a Strange Multiplicity, James Tully for sure. Barbara Arneal, what is the name? It's one of her most recent books, Domestic Colonies, I think. Eva Mackey, House of Difference, and also a book that came out of hers recently. I mean, Eva Mackey's work just generally. Anything by Heidi Stark on treaties. There's this amazing article, and it shook me to my core, and I can't believe I can't remember the name of it.
It's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and I believe Wayne Yang.
I guess from here, before we go kind of more into the article itself and like deep diving on that, I want to just kind of go over some of maybe definitional stuff, just so it's clear that when we're using these words like colonial denizen throughout the podcast, that people have a clear idea of what you are meaning by that. So let's start with colonial denizen, and specifically maybe a bit of the historical context as well, and how you're co-opting and changing it for Indigenous work specifically.
For sure. So as a political term, it's also a biological term, but I've been using it as a political term. Denizen derives from ancient Roman and later medieval European practices. So in ancient Rome, the denizen, or more specifically, civita sun suffragio, which I apologize, I don't speak Latin, but it means citizen without the vote, was actually used as a tool of colonialism. The Roman Empire, in looking to extend its power of influence, would, when they would conquer a new territory, extend access to the Roman civil law, which the bigger that the Roman Empire became, the hotter of a commodity access to Roman civil law became. And so they would extend access to this law on the condition that those newly conquered people would send them a certain number of soldiers for the Roman army each year. Later in medieval England, it's used to keep foreign nationals in check. They would allow select foreign clergy and merchants full access to property ownership in England, as well as access to British courts of law once they performed an act of fealty to the crown sovereign. So obviously, in being historically tied up with colonial practices, there's a real question as to why I'm looking to invoke and salvage the term for decolonial purposes. And I would argue that it's threefold, my reasoning here. First of all, the core of the political term, foreigners in need of invitation, holds considerable potential in and of itself toward encouraging a decolonial paradigm shift, and helps to highlight non-Indigenous vulnerability on Indigenous lands. Secondly, I think its use by ancient Rome and medieval England demonstrates the term isn't confined to state-centric models or logics, and therefore opens the door to what decolonization could look like beyond our specific contemporary instantiations of the nation-state. But also that modern applications of the term in citizenship studies suggest that there are productive creative capacities, and even potentially positive connotations inherent with the term itself. So, for instance, Mick Smith's work suggests that thinking through a denizenship could provide us with a different way of orienting ourselves with the human and non-human world that would ultimately or could ultimately better align with an environmental ethics.
Okay, great. And building off of that, the other major term I want to kind of define for this podcast would be Indigenous legal frameworks, and specifically envisioning someone who might not have much familiarity with either Indigenous law or traditionally or the ways it's been institutionalized in certain ways within the Canadian legal system. So just kind of go through that if you can.
For sure. So it's hardly my area of expertise. But in my understanding, these would be the frameworks of Indigenous law and legal systems as we find within the traditional and contemporary legal processes, languages, cultures, and oral traditions of variously situated Indigenous peoples. So, for instance, for Haudenosaunee people, I think the Great Law of Peace would be a very important aspect of a broader legal system, or at least indicative of the tenets that are present or the values that are present within a broader legal system. But we also have, modern instantiations like Gladue courts, and what have you. Furthermore, I think if anyone is interested in looking into Indigenous legal frameworks further in terms of scholarship that has been completed around that or is in the works, John Burroughs, Aaron Mills have a lot of work specifically for Anishinaabe legal systems. The University of Victoria also has a legal studies program wherein you can get not only your JD, but an Indigenous legal degree as well upon completion of your legal studies.
Nice. And kind of transitioning out of the more definitional side of things, this whole article is kind of built around the colonial denizen, or also I think used in your work was sympathetic settlers. What made you focus there, and how unique is that within? Well, at least it's my perception that that's a relatively unique focus within Indigenous studies, just because you either see a focus on Indigenous people or more the colonial perspective. But this is kind of like a middle ground between sympathetic settlers. So how did you come across that as a topic you're interested in, and I guess just discuss that a little bit.
For sure. It's a good question. I don't actually think of my work as sitting in Indigenous studies. I think of it as sitting in settler colonial studies, in political theory, maybe looking to, in part, speak to Indigenous studies. But at the end of the day, what I was finding a lot in terms of, trying to find some sort of answer into, okay, what, as a non-Indigenous person, what can I actually do? At least through the literature, and being consistently met with very useful descriptions of what colonialism was, of what a role as any given, colonizer is. There's various terms. There's settler, there's arrivant, there's colonialist. So I guess I was really trying to look for a normative element that I found was lacking in such a descriptively focused literature. And so I think the inspiration behind using the colonial denizen was really twofold. In part, I wanted a fresh term that helped us move beyond, but still grapple with the more easily, I guess, guilt-ridden colonialist perspective. And the terms we're usually met with, like settler. which I do think really have their place as necessarily unsettling. And so I didn't want the denizen to replace it. I wanted it to work within the cacophony of various terms. So yeah, it was important for me that the term could sit within the literature as an additional term rather than a replacement. But I also wanted a term that stood in distinction to citizen, specifically, because it became clear to me that there is a tendency to take our citizenship as non-Indigenous peoples for granted, when its very existence and the privileges it provides rests on and have been structured and sustained through colonialism. And that's something we don't really talk about too much. Denizen isn't, of course, a complete opposite, but in being so closely aligned and yet so different, I think the term helps us in encouraging non-Indigenous peoples to rethink their citizenship, to rethink what citizenship means, where it comes from, what biases it carries, and to realize at the end of the day, it is a social construct that has an innate relationship with colonialism.
And there may be no answer to this question, but when you use the word colonial denizen, or actually maybe sympathetic settlers might be a more apt for this question, do you envision any specific interest groups within Canada right now, or it's more just a general, for whoever might want to subscribe to this kind of theory kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't have any particular groups in mind. I think it's proffered really for the average non-Indigenous person who's looking for answers as one potential way of moving forward beyond others.
And how could future theorists or policymakers, maybe a more apt question would be, how would you, if a future theorist or policymaker was to use your work, how could you see it developing, or how would you like it to develop, or what limits would you like to tell them, don't go crazy with this, what in terms of moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious to see where people would take it. I don't know that I'd say, oh, don't take it here or there. My main concern would be to say, don't have the drive of whatever it is you're doing be the search for invitation. Even though I know that's the whole premise of the denizen, I think that if that happens, then it ruins the entire process if we're so overly focused on trying to secure that invitation, because that recenters non-Indigenous people within decolonization, which then inevitably means that we're actually looking for settler futurity and security rather than Indigenous resurgence and the recentering of Indigenous lives and lands. Having said that, I think there are still so many interesting applications that it could take. For the policymaker, it would be so interesting if self-governance talks were approached, not from the position of the Canadian state, but from the position of potential denizen. I mean, how would that change the discussion? I think that would be fascinating. Or if we, approach educational jurisdiction and funding for on-reserve education from that point, what would a potential, governance structure look like? I don't know. I think there are endless possibilities. My main concern would be to not privilege a drive toward invitation.
Okay. And when you say invitation, is that a direct communication line between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, or do you envision more a self-discovery process of the non-Indigenous person to kind of take on that mindset without a direct, approval, right, from an Indigenous person when you're talking about the role of invitations.
Yeah. So when I'm talking about invitation, I'm more specifically thinking of property. I'm not thinking of the invitation for discussion. I think that taking up a denizen ethos is very much a dialogical process. I think you still have to pick and choose where it's appropriate and also know the social protocol around where and when it's appropriate. But invitation, as at least I've been thinking it through and meant to convey it within the article, is specifically focused on invitation onto Indigenous lands, not invitation into dialogical.
And how does your theory of the colonial denizen, well, I guess let me word it this way. Like, in what ways do current attempts at reconciliation, do you think, fall short, and in what ways can the colonial denizen kind of make up for shortcomings in the current way either the state or lower levels of federal government go about reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think reconciliation attempts in here, I'm largely thinking of, state-driven ones, can be very important moments for individuals and even communities, as well as teachable moments for non-Indigenous Canadians. But largely, at least state-based reconciliation efforts tend to be really surface-based. They tend not to make or suggest terribly substantive changes to our structures and processes. Now, I think the report on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 is a milestone and demonstrative of some initial steps that we could take and should take. But here I think it's really in the uptake. The whole actions speak louder than words. That's the most important part, and I think, continues to be the most important part. Though I am hopeful that you make some steps forward here as well, and have seen some suggestions that there have been positive movement. So I guess in that line of thought, when it comes to the colonial denizen, it's about realizing the importance for action. It's about realizing that it's more than just words of support. That is an important aspect. But it's looking to identify how can I, even with the calls to action for reconciliation, how do I look to implement this in my workplace? How do I look to implement this as a citizen of Canada? I mean, I think that there's, a lot of possibilities and ideas within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself. Having said all of that, I think the broader problem that's occurring is that identifying and approaching change, first and foremost, about reconciliation rather than decolonization, is a big issue here. Because they're two very different, well, not very different, but I think they're two different beasts. Reconciliation is about ameliorating relationships that have, quote unquote, gone bad, when decolonization is about looking to move forward in a way that doesn't continue to uphold and instantiate colonialism. And so I think it's really putting the cart before the horse, talking about reconciliation before decolonization, because you have to address the root problems before you can make nice. Making nice and not fully addressing the problems means that the problems are still there. And so, another aspect in terms of what can denizens do, what can, non-Indigenous Canadians do, is to educate ourselves on what those problems are and how our, connection to property regimes helps uphold colonialism, how our citizenship in its various ways upholds colonialism, how the narratives we tell ourselves about Canada do that as well on a daily basis.
Let's take someone who's just learning about Indigenous issues. Let's say maybe they're not familiar with Canada, so maybe they're a new immigrant or something like that. And they are and they're trying to learn about it, and they're open to this idea of denizenship or, working through the process of invitation from the Indigenous community, generally speaking, within Canada. What major things do you see? What major areas do you see that focusing on? Is that the historical relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous people? Is it the environment? Like, what kind of, can you maybe build out some bullet points of areas that you would think someone should or would focus on through this process, kind of thing, if that makes sense?
So first and foremost, I think real world manifestations, in terms of what specific responsibilities would look like, would always be local and specific and established and defined through dialogue with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Having said that, there's preliminary work that I think we all need to do. And so I guess early set of baseline responsibilities or ways of orienting oneself that could be thought of as part of the thought experiment of the colonial denizen. So here I would include, knowing your personal and civic stories of settlement, educating yourself on the various ways that colonialism exists today, and how you're implicated as a citizen or a permanent resident, for instance, within those systems, and challenging and looking to change these structures and systems where appropriate and where possible. To support resurgence efforts of Indigenous peoples where appropriate, to enter into dialogue with Indigenous and other non-Indigenous peoples where appropriate, to be willing to decenter oneself from the discussion around decolonization, and to willingly and actively imagine a world, a state, a city, a town that is otherwise in collaborating with others, specifically Indigenous peoples.
And kind of built off of that same kind of thought experiment I just offered, like the newcomer, or someone who might not know about, the history of Indigenous people within Canada and the role the state has played. In what ways, Canada is a large part of, even as a large literature like Canadian exceptionalism, which I think is a bit pompous, but, a lot of literature within sociology and political science is built around kind of the multicultural ethos and then building on that inclusion and equality. But a lot of that is viewing each group within Canada on equal terms. And in what ways does this do you think, does the colonial denizen break away from that? And what ways do you feel like that is not harmful, but that is, in a way, that kind of main narrative about Canada, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe doesn't privilege the Indigenous identity and what you would say is the role of us being denizens in seeking an invitation from Indigenous people.
So how does denizen interact with basically the narrative around multiculturalism?
Kind of a long-winded version of kind of saying that, yeah.
Okay, well, I think part of what the denizen does is disrupt that narrative in what I would say is a helpful way, because I think that narrative, how do I put this? I think that narrative works a lot like narratives around reconciliation. It's very much a surface approach, and it's part and parcel of this rhetoric that we tell ourselves as Canadians, that we have this exceptionalism, that we are so inviting and inclusive of both historically and today, of all people. And it's simply not entirely true. We have this narrative of having helped with the Underground Railroad and how we were a safe space. We had slaves. French Canadians had slaves in, the late, I believe, 1600s and into the 1700s. It's a bit of a whitewashing in a lot of contexts, and I think it's a story that specifically non-Indigenous, specifically white Canadians. I mean, it extends beyond that, but non-Indigenous society within Canada tells itself that it's multicultural. That doesn't mean that, landed immigrants, that racialized people experience the same Canada that Caucasian Canadians experience. I think that there are so many lines of domination and subjection beyond a colonial, decolonial framework that, in terms of looking at who is the denizen within a multicultural scope, within, beyond the looking specifically at the Canadian citizen, looking at the refugee, looking at all of these people who are situated within power structures in various different ways, it becomes a question of, well, how am I situated within this discourse, this narrative, the complex set of relationships. And in terms of multiculturalism, I really think it is just part and parcel of the citizenship narrative that we tell ourselves. And I think the denizen has a potential role to play in helping us disrupt and identify, not only the ways that citizenship has been used as a tool to colonize and further seek to erase Indigenous others, but also seek to erase the racialized others, any others who are not, liberal, rational white men at the end of the day.
And kind of building off that within the same topic of multiculturalism. Actually, in preparation for this podcast, I talked to some of my friends. This is somewhat anecdotal, but I feel like you might get this a lot. It might be somewhat of a common phenomenon within Canada of talking about your article and some of the questions I was thinking about asking, and I was kind of telling them the general idea of what you were saying. And in this case, one of my friends is an immigrant herself, and she was like, well, why would I have to be a denizen? I just got here. My ancestors weren't part of the colonialization process. And so I guess what would you say to, people who say that, which is not necessarily, I'm not saying this is like a bad or evil thing to say. I mean, it's a very logical conclusion someone might come if they just arrived here. But what would you say to them in response to that about how they might want to think about their role within the Canadian state? Yeah,
no, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I you're not the first to bring this up, for sure. It came up repeatedly with my committee. I would say that the important difference here is how we're talking about and thinking about colonialism. Colonialism isn't just an historic event. It is an ongoing reality and set of processes and structures and that continue today. And so, yes, maybe it means that me, as a 13th generation French Canadian on my father's side, maybe I have more of a responsibility as a colonial denizen because of the roles of my ancestors in colonizing these lands. But that isn't to say that a first generation Canadian or even somebody who's just visiting the country for a short period of time doesn't still have a stake in the game, isn't still experiencing privileges that they wouldn't otherwise be able to experience because of these various systems and structures of contemporary colonialism. And so my suggestion would be to discuss those and to talk about that and to encourage the person that you're discussing this with to realize those moments and those very real ways in which, oh, you're renting an apartment here as a student. Well, how does that then implicate you in the colonial process and structure around property rights, living on Indigenous lands? Because, I mean, all of Canada in some way or form is Indigenous land, so.
Okay. And, you know, it's kind of building off of that, and it don't want to sound too extreme with this, but I was thinking about this and, like, you know, because, you know, many either new immigrants or even people who have been here for a few generations, they might say, you know, I didn't directly take part in any colonial processes. You know, how do you safeguard theories like this from either promoting intergenerational guilt or being clear in their messaging so that people don't feel that that is what the theory is suggesting? If that makes sense.
So sorry, to be clear, that the theory isn't suggesting that we should all intergenerationally feel guilty?
Well, I'm saying there could be a plausible reading of theories like this that is, people could read it as intergenerational guilt, like you're applying the guilt of, or even people, I guess, who have like your family who have been here for 12 generations and so have a very like historic lineage within Canada and the colonialization process. You know, yeah, I don't really know how to word this properly, but I guess what would you say in ways in which theories like this are not applying intergenerational guilt to people, to families, basically?
For sure. You know, I mean, first and foremost, I don't know that guilt should be avoided altogether. I think it has its place in unsettling. But of course, the big danger is that guilt can lead to inaction. And it can become so all-consuming that you become stuck. So I think where the denizen helps here, or at least my intention with it, is in refocusing on responsibility, which is a much more active response to acknowledgement of past and current wrongs, which leaves some room for guilt, but also holds optimism and perhaps more importantly, the connection to the collective, where I think guilt, even at an intergenerational level, can become a very individual experience. Responsibility is always connected in an active way towards others. And so while the enormity of the responsibilities to support resurgence, to question state systems that sustain colonialism, to recognize, you know, the legitimacy of Indigenous governance structures and legal orders, etc., you know, can be really overwhelming in their sheer breadth. I think responsibility in actively connecting us to others drives us toward action. And so I don't think it's, you know, necessarily about protecting us or safeguarding us from guilt per se, but of offering something more and looking at something more and realizing that, you know, guilt might have its place, but it should never be the end of the road. I mean, it's a form of, I think, defeatism.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end off the, I guess, substantive talk about the article itself and the concepts within it. I would like to end off the last few questions just talking a little bit about where your work in the future is going and what you're looking forward to.
No, I'm not. I haven't been doing any of it. Prep for this week was like intense because I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to get into an academic mindset. I've been working with community for the past 3 years, and I haven't dropped it, but I've dropped it as an academic exercise, and I've, I guess, taken it up, trying to live my words.
Well, do you want to talk a bit about what you've worked on in the last 3 years then, in terms of in communities and stuff?
Honestly, I've just been working for a Indigenous nonprofit educational organization, an Indigenous institute within Ontario that, is really focused on closing educational and socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I've been helping them. Initially, I was helping run some of their university and lifelong learning programs and development. And now I work in advancement to help write tons of grants to help fund really amazing and innovative, culturally grounded programming that's available to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples within the area.
And based on that work you're doing, moving away from theory, are there any major changes you'd like to see in the education system that we have set up in Canada, that either at the university or the grade school level for non-Indigenous people, or even access to education for Indigenous people? What are some thoughts you have on that?
Yeah. Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So many thoughts. We might need a new podcast. We can start with Indigenous institutes. They offer programming that's on par with public universities and colleges in Ontario, and yet, and it's geared towards change, but they don't necessarily receive the same consistent, reliable funding that major universities and colleges do within the province. And so, seeing that change, seeing consistent, reliable funding for various Indigenous organizations or other organizations that are focused on decolonization, on education throughout the province and the country would be amazing. I have my own thoughts that I think are even go beyond, decolonization in terms of our public education system. I think there's so much we can do in Ontario. I think that there's been a lot of amazing changes to the BC public school curriculum that it would be cool to see, considered within Ontario. For instance, looking at broadening the scope in terms of how we approach education.
Thank you for coming on the CJPS podcast. This was Deanne Leblanc talking about her theory of the colonial denizen. Thanks for coming on and discussing your theory, and hopefully there are some inspired theorists from this podcast alone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insights, the Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. This was Deanne Leblanc discussing the topic of decolonization and the colonial denizen. For future episodes, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP, or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. If you want to support the CJPS podcast, we welcome any distribution of our episodes and further reading of the articles discussed. The goal of this podcast is to distribute political science content in a more accessible format. Thank you for listening.